Welcome back to the Kelly Symone Podcast, where we lead well from the inside out. I am your host, Kelly Symone, and today we are adding another addition to our Leadership Lessons series. This episode is all about leadership lessons from the Joe Budden Podcast. That's right. I bet you didn't think I was going to say that. Leadership lessons from the Joe Budden Podcast. You ready? Let's get into it. So let's just do a quick refresher on our leadership lessons series. This is going to be a mini episode. Leadership lessons is where we dig into current events and what's going on with notable figures. We study the greats and to upgrade our leadership skills. And so today's focus is going to be the Joe Budden Podcast. Now, if you're not familiar with the Joe Budden Podcast, let me give you a little bit of background. Joe Budden, the namesake of the podcast, is a retired artist turned media mogul. That's right, Joe Budden from Pump It Up fame, if you remember that song, that rap song from the early 2000s. He went on to have a few more commercial hits, and then he transitioned into being a very successful mixtape rap artist before retiring from music and transitioning fully into a career as a media personality. So he started a podcast with his friends Rory and Mal about 5 to 7 years ago. I'm not exactly sure of the date. And about 3 years ago, the podcast really took off and they became one of the top podcasts, if not the number one podcast in the podcast world. They have a music lifestyle podcast. The guys, they get together with their engineer and producer Parks, and they talk about different things that are going on in the music industry as well as their life. They have a very unique kind of barbershop take on different topics. And so I'm going to tell you right now, if you're interested in checking out the podcast, if you're not already familiar, it is definitely not safe for work. And if you are super religious, if you're a super saint, this probably is not the podcast for you. If you are like me, though, and you're a church kid who grew up listening to Wu-Tang, this is probably going to be right up your alley because the guys are always entertaining, often controversial, and never boring. And so I happen to be a fan of the podcast, and there have been some recent events over the last 4 to 5 months that I thought would make great content for our leadership lessons. So everything was looking great. They had awesome sponsorship deals. They were making lots of money. They were touring the country, selling merch. They were doing things that probably no other podcast had done before. I mean, they were essentially podcast rock stars. But behind the scenes, there was building tension, just different personalities, as well as what appears to be a little bit of a lack of transparency about the finances that led to some on-screen tension and eventually came to a head when Joe hosted an episode kind of on his lonesome. At least he was the only person on screen, where he was firing his co-stars. He fired Rory and Mal, didn't fire Parks. Parks is still on the Joe Budden podcast. And I mean, the media world kind of erupted because they had gotten so much great coverage from media, from business, from tech. And then to see them kind of spiral out was very shocking to a lot of people, and it upset a lot of fans. And so I thought this would be a great time to learn some leadership lessons from the Joe Budden podcast. And let's start with number one. Leaders are human. A lot of times we think our leaders are superhuman. They got superpowers. They're super creative. They're super operationally efficient. They always know exactly what to say. They've got the talent. They've got the anointing if you're in ministry, and all of those things are true. But just because you have superpowers does not mean that you are not human. In fact, leaders are superhuman. That means that we can make mistakes just like anybody else. We can have mistakes in judgment. We can have mistakes in personnel decisions. We can have errors in how we decide to handle a particular issue, which I'm going to get to that with Joe in just a minute. We can read data incorrectly. We can take the wrong bet on a product or a service. I mean, there is a long list of responsibilities for leaders. And with every responsibility, not only is there an opportunity for success, but there's also an opportunity for dropping the ball. And so when you know that, you kind of just want to relax, exhale, and let that actually take some of the pressure off. I know that actually sounds like there's more pressure on you, but if you already know that everything can't rest on one person's shoulders, it'll help you seek wisdom and seek help. That's one prayer that I get up and I pray every single day, because I know as a leader, whether I'm leading my life or leading in my company or at work, I know that I need wisdom that I don't have. I need help. I need support. And I tap into the real superpower, which is God, to get the help that I need so that I don't make crash and burn mistakes every single day, because we make thousands of decisions every single day. Nobody knows everything. Nobody's going to get everything right. And so why rely on your own logic, your own experience, and frankly, your own ego to make decisions for you when you have the help of the Holy Spirit available to you? Not only do you have the help of the Holy Spirit, but you also have skill development, professional skill development that will help you make better decisions, that will help you execute at a higher level. And so it's important to seek mentors. It's important to educate yourself. It's important to seek coaches, that can help you lead at a higher level in an authentic way from the inside out, so that when you show up to play, when you show up to work, you are ready. You are prepared as much as you can be. You've done the work on the inside. You've learned what you needed to learn. And now it's time for you to pull the trigger, make the decision, and trust God to produce the results. But don't ever forget that you're human. Give yourself the grace to learn. Give yourself time for learning curves. I will tell you, in this situation, listening to what was going on behind the scenes with the guys, it seemed like there were some mistakes on both ends. That Joe made some mistakes in communication, which we're going to get to next, and that the guys also made some mistakes in kind of just going along instead of really making sure that they understood exactly what business they were in and what the terms of their agreements were, because that ended up being a major sticking point. It actually ended up blowing the whole podcast up, and so when you don't make sure that you're ironing out those details, you're liable to make mistakes based on emotion, based on ego, and not based on intent and mission that you guys are called to. Leadership lesson number 2: communicate, and communicate some more. You will never communicate enough as a leader. Communicate verbally, communicate visually, communicate in writing, draw a sign, draw a picture. Okay, create an experience. Communicate, because the state of the communication of your relationship is the state of your relationship, professional and personal. That is true. Now, in the case of the Joe Budden podcast, communication seems to be the main issue between the guys. Joe had a certain understanding of how the business was being run based on his experience as an artist and based on his business savvy from being an artist in the industry for as many years as he had been. The guys, while they are also industry insiders, I don't think they had ever been on this side of the deal. I know Rory has some management experience. Maul is someone who grew up in a musical family. His brothers, one of his brothers is one of the co-founders of Rockefeller Records and the current executive with Roc Nation. And so he's been around the industry, but I don't think that they were familiar were some of the terms and conditions of the contracts that they signed. And it seemed like Joe was extremely familiar. And somehow in there, they didn't understand how to do business well together and move forward with the same understanding. And this gets even more complicated when you're doing business with friends. Joe and Maul had been friends, I believe, for almost 20 years. And Joe and Rory had been friends for maybe close to 10 years. And so they definitely weren't strangers to each other. And like I said, they weren't strangers to the business. But listen, I know from experience that doing business with your friends means that you are going to have to go overboard on communication. Why? Because not only are you navigating the business relationships, you're also navigating your personal relationship. And so it requires an exceptional amount of emotional maturity to have those tough conversations, to create great boundaries for, okay, this is a friendship conversation. This is a business conversation. This is something that we can handle ourselves. This is something we need to get a professional third party in. Like in the case of the podcast, they needed managers and lawyers in some of these conversations so that they wouldn't have come to the disagreement of going their separate ways, which is eventually what happened. So when you are doing business with friends or with anyone, it's important to understand what the expectations are, what your commitment looks like. Really write it out. Be prescriptive. Don't think that you're doing overboard. Don't think that it should be automatically understood, because what you think is par for the course might be completely foreign to someone. Case in point, in the case of Joe and Maul had an idea of respect that was not consistent with Joe's idea of respect. And so they came to it interpersonal differences because, there was a lot of offense taken at the way certain things were handled and some of the verbiage that was used and the approach. I mean, anytime you go on air and fire someone, for the entire world to see, yeah, people are probably going to be offended. They're probably going to feel disrespected. And so making sure that you're communicating with the tone in which you want to be received, making sure that you understand what the other party means by respect, what the other party means by fair, what the other party understands their expectations and their contributions are supposed to be, and what the timeline is for following through on those things. That's really important, especially when you're friends, because the loyalty of friendship is a little bit different than the loyalty of business. The loyalty of friendship oftentimes is not dependent upon whether the person is right or wrong. When you're loyal to your friend, you're going to be there for them, even when they do things that you're not okay with. You might pull them to the side and tell them, but you're not going to stop being friends with them. In business, the loyalty is pretty much limited to the terms of the contract. So as long as both parties are fulfilling their end, then they'll continue to have a positive relationship, a loyal, so-called loyal relationship with each other. But as soon as the performance changes, that may actually alter the nature of the relationship, and what once was amicable can become adversarial. And we don't want that, especially when you don't want to lose your business partner, but you definitely don't want to lose your friend. And honestly, as a fan of the show, that was the thing that kind of hurt my heart the most. Other than I really enjoyed the podcast as it was, I find it very entertaining. I am someone who grew up. My first job was in a hair salon, and it was a barbershop in the front. And so I extremely familiar with barbershop talk, because I grew up listening to guys have all these kind of crazy conversations just a few feet away from me. And so every time I would listen to the podcast, it would kind of take me back to that place of, ear hustling on, the guy's point of view on things, even if I didn't agree with it, because, I'm a woman, I don't agree with a lot of the stuff that they said. And like I said, that podcast is not safe for work and it's not for super saints. So just in case you decide to listen to it, but what it will do is entertain you. And so not only did I miss the original version of the podcast, but I really wanted them to be able to work things out as friends. And because I personally have been there, I have worked for a friend before, I understand how those lines can get blurred and how much work you have to put in to make sure that you're not just communicating as a great business partner, as a direct report, as a direct leader, but also as a friend, that you are um, adding to that relationship and not just taking away from it because you expect a lot of deference and a lot of grace because of your foundation of friendship. You want to make sure that you are feeding the friendship and not just feeding off of it. Number 2, communicate, 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 communicate. You got to do it. You got to do it because, again, communication is the lifeblood of your relationship. Number 3, make sure that you know the recipe to your secret sauce. Now, this one, I'm going to lay this one on Joe. You know, don't hate me, Joe. Don't get mad if you're listening. But I think based on the way that he kind of discussed how his decisions were made in podcasts after the one podcast where he fired everybody, it seemed like Joe thought that the Joe Budden podcast was more, that the appeal was more about him than it was about the group dynamic. And I think that was a mistake on his part. And sometimes if you're a cook, you know that if you've made something a million times, sometimes you think, oh, I know this recipe, by heart off the back of my hand. I don't have to look it up. I don't have to, pull everything out in front of me and make sure I don't forget anything. I don't need a list when I go to the grocery store. And then you get in the kitchen and you start to make it and you get to the end and you're like, wait, this doesn't taste the same. Something's missing. Oh, wait, I thought I knew the recipe, but it turns out that I don't. Maybe I should have written it down. Maybe I should have made a list, so forth and so on. I think what happened with Joe is he started cooking up and he thought he knew the recipe from all of his previous successes in the media. He thought that it really on him. And listen, Joe Budden is one of a kind. He is an amazing storyteller. You can't take that away from him. He was that in rap, and he is that as a media personality. And, he deserves the success that he has. No doubt about it. But the appeal of the Joe Budden podcast was the friendship and the camaraderie. It was also the kind of anti-establishment take that they had on musicians and being in favor of creatives and the artists. And when they started talking about all the money issues and the transparency issues, it ran counter to the narrative and the brand that they had created as a podcast, as a unit. So those two things were integral recipes to the podcast. And I don't think in his approach to ending his relationship, his business relationship with Roy and Ma, he really took that into consideration. I think he may have been a little bit more in his feelings based on his perspective, which is valid. I mean, he had some valid issues with the guys. They probably just needed to be addressed differently and definitely behind the scenes. But in the way that everything went down, it appeared that he thought that, hey, as long as it's Joe Budden, it's going to be fine. People are going to rock with it. Well, the fans had a different idea. And while the new version of the Joe Budden podcast has 2 different co-hosts on there, Ice and Ish, and they're great as well. They're great in their own right. They're not Mal and Rory, though. And so there's a completely different fan base that is going to be attracted to that show. Now, I enjoy that show as well. It's definitely different than how it was, and it's a different recipe. So listen, you get people hooked on one version of spaghetti and then you start switching it up and people are like, wait a minute, hold on. You didn't tell me it was going to be like this. I don't like this. And, people start having this reaction. And I think that's what he experienced at this time. And listen, I don't think Joe Budden is a very sensitive person. He's endured quite a bit of internet the internet has dragged him plenty of times before. So I don't think he's the most sensitive person in the world, but I think this was different. It's different when you misunderstand why people are rocking with you. It's different when you misunderstand why your customers are your customers, or why your clients are your clients, or why people go to your church and they don't go to a different church. It's really important as a leader to keep your ear to the street, and as much as possible, keep your ego out of it, so that you can really understand the contributions of the people around you. You may be the star of the show. Indeed, Joe Budden is the star of the Joe Budden Podcast. No doubt about that. I don't think anybody would have argued about that, not even Rory and Mal. But Rory and Mal brought something to the show that Joe cannot bring on his own. And I think he found out just how valuable they were to the fans and to the brand of the Joe Budden Podcast after their untimely, very messy exit. Now, you as a leader, you don't want to find out the way Joe Budden found out. And I'm going to help you understand how you can avoid that in the future. And one of the things that you have to do as a leader is create a culture of honor. Now, a lot of times in the church world, when we say honor, a lot of people are referring to honoring God or honoring your leader, honoring your pastor, and all of those things are good. But I personally think that we spend too much time honoring up and not enough time honoring horizontally, and making sure that you're honoring the people who look up to you for leadership support. So what does that look like? That looks like respecting the contributions of people. That looks like listening when people are giving you feedback, when people are giving you qualified advice. And qualified does not mean that they have a better role than you or a bigger role than you. Qualified means they have experienced what they are talking about enough to give you wisdom. Okay? They have enough experience in what they are discussing with you to give you wisdom. Enough is a very relative term. Okay? So when you have people who are willing to step up and willing to contribute, and there's room for them to do so, allow them to do so. Show an interest in people's personal lives to the point where they are comfortable and where it is appropriate. Don't overstep. These are just different ways that you can show honor. You can create an environment where people feel valued, where people feel like their voice matters, and people understand that their contributions are respected, and that you don't think that everything just revolves around you as a leader or the senior leadership team wherever you are. The people who do the work, the people who work alongside you, their opinions, their work, their contribution also matters. And all of it together is creating the tapestry of art that you guys are putting out into the world, whether it's a product, a service, whether it's a congregation. It could be anything. It takes everybody to put it out into the world so that anybody can benefit from it. So make sure that you're creating a culture of honor so that you understand exactly what is the recipe to your secret sauce. Our last leadership lesson from the Joe Budden Podcast is to keep moving forward. Now, listen, I wish the guys were still together. I like Ice and Ish too. I kind of want all of them to be on the podcast together, to be honest. Like, I don't know, maybe they can just switch off and take turns, and we can have a really immature podcast one time and a really mature podcast another time. You know, that's kind of how that goes. But it looks like at this time they are not able to reconcile, either personally or professionally. And I do hope that that changes in the future, because I really enjoyed hearing them talk just as friends. Like I said, that there's nothing like that barbershop culture, I got to tell you. But I'm glad that everybody has kept moving forward. You know, as leaders, like I said, we're human. We make mistakes, we fall, we bump our head. And I think everybody in this situation wears some accountability and some responsibility. I think Rory and Mal should have done a better job of pushing for the answers that they needed behind the scenes. I think they should have taken more responsibility and understanding exactly what they had signed up for and what the expectation and what Joe expected from them. And they should have done a better job of incorporating their management and their attorneys, which I'm sure that they know and they understand now in hindsight. And I also think that Joe should have taken more time to really invest in himself as an executive. You know, sometimes when your experience is being the center of attention and you're the artist and people kind of work around you and they're always in orbit around you, you don't know how to now be that executive that other people need. You don't know how to make the transition from being the artist to being the boss, and understanding that when you transition to being the boss, that relationship with your team is going to change just a little bit. Even when that team is full of your friends, they're not going to talk the same around you. They are going to complain sometimes. That's just part of it. It doesn't mean that they hate you. It doesn't mean that they're not your friends. It just means, people are at work and they complain. It happens. Get over it. I think he maybe didn't understand what all came with being an executive. I don't think he had ever been in this position before. And that's what happens. I mean, it's a great problem to have when you have new success and you're trying to figure out how to be successful in your success, right? And so this is one of the lessons that he's had to learn. And I'm glad that he's kept moving forward with the podcast, and he's kept moving forward with Ice and Ish. They're creating a different brand. Their show is very different than how it was before, but it is enjoyable and it is something to see. And it's very inspiring to see people get knocked down and stand back up and keep going, because as artists, as creators, as leaders, as entrepreneurs, like we said, every day is not a great day. And if you really believe in your mission and your vision, and you really have the confidence, and if you're really anointed and called by God to do what you're doing, guess what? You don't get to put it down just because you got hurt, you got hit, or you drop the ball. Pick that ball back up and keep going. I'm glad that Rory and Mal were able to create their own platform and their own podcast, and they're able to kind of shine in some different ways that we didn't even know they had talents in some of the areas that they are operating in now. I mean, they're writing sketches and acting, and they didn't do any of that when they were on the podcast before. And so there's a different way that we get to see them and enjoy them. And I think it's working for them. And so I want to say that that's an amazing opportunity that, sometimes when you get quote unquote cut from the team or you get rejected, sometimes people want to pick up their ball and go home and give up and start to identify with the narrative of, oh, I'm a loser, or, oh, wow, I really messed this up, or I can't believe this person did this to me, and they become a victim. Well, that is not something that they did at all. And I think you should be inspired by their ingenuity. And I think you should be inspired by their resilience. And you should keep going. If something happens to you that's unpleasant, if you get mistreated or treated unfairly, or a business deal goes bad like it did in this situation, you can recover. And not only can you recover, you can go full steam ahead and get full restoration and create your own lane. It may even be one of the best things that's ever happened to you. I've been through some situations where I've had people try to blackball me. I've had people create whole narratives about me. And I remember this one situation that I was in, and I thought my reputation was gone. And I was so upset because I had worked so hard to build an amazing reputation as a leader, and having this one experience with this direct report that I had tried to help, it just seemed like everything was a wash. It turns out that situation, when I decided to trust God and allow God to work it out on my behalf and just remain true to who I was, it turns out to be one of the best situations that ever happened to me. And by the time God got finished doing what only God can do, my reputation was in better hands, and I had more influence and more opportunities at the end of it than I did at the beginning. And it didn't take a long time either, like 2 weeks for that whole thing to be resolved. And so I want to encourage you guys as leaders, if you can learn one thing from the Joe Budden podcast, and Joe Budden specifically, as well as Rory and Ma, is to keep the faith. Keep the faith. Nobody can do what they did together as a unit and what they are now doing separately without truly believing in themselves and truly believing in their art and in their cause and what they represent. And even though they went their own separate ways, they're still being consistent and still being true to who they are. And that's admirable. You should do the same. If at first you don't succeed, as Aaliyah said, dust yourself off and try again. Yes. So let's recap our leadership lessons from the Joe Budden podcast. Number one, leaders are human. Don't be afraid. Don't be alarmed. You are human. You need help. Ask for wisdom every day, because the wisdom that you have, the experience that you have, I guarantee you it's not enough on your own. Number 2, communicate. And then when you think you're done, communicate some more, because communication is the lifeblood of your relationships. And whatever the state of communication is in your business, in your ministry, that is the state of the relationship of that business and of that ministry. Number 3, make sure that you know the recipe to your secret sauce. Don't take a single ingredient for granted. Make sure that you create a culture of honor where every ingredient can be brought to its peak and everything can stand out and every ingredient can shine. And number 4, keep moving forward. No matter what happens, you fall, you get back up, you figure out what you did wrong. Don't do it again. Don't stay a hamster on the wheel, but keep moving forward. Your future is worthy of your investment. Well, that's all today for the Kelly Symone Podcast. Let me know what your favorite leadership lesson was from this episode, and who else should we pick for our next leadership lessons segment, our next addition to this series. We're going to keep this series going. I know last time we did leadership lessons from The Last Dance, which was the Jordan documentary, and everybody really liked that. I think that was everybody's favorite episode, actually, from last season. So let me know what you want to see, what you want to talk about on the podcast. As always, you can reach out to me at the Kelly Symone on Instagram, also on LinkedIn, or send me a shout out at hello@kellysymone.com. You can email me there. All right. Well, thanks for hanging out with me today. And until next time, keep leading well from the inside out.